Shangyin, Cicada. Hard to be so lofty and sate your hunger. Futile your whispers of distress. By the fifth watch you faded out. Your green tree host, indifferent to your fate. Scholar, tree branch, both were helpless in a flood. My yard's already overgrown with weeds. I'm troubled, sir, by your warning song. Down here, we too survive on empty air. So, we have here the first poem of Li Shangyin. And you will be asking yourselves, who is Li Shangyin? Well, he's a very important figure. Li Shangyin is arguably the greatest poet of the late Tang. This is recognized by this anthology because he has 24 poems in it. That is a huge number. I think he is only beaten by, of course, Li Bai and Du Fu. Now let's talk a little bit about Li Shangyin. When we talked previously about Du Mu, and I think also about Shu Hong, we talked a little bit about the late Tang period. Now, one of the main characteristics of the late Tang period was the infighting of factions at court. Basically, two very big factions: the Li faction and what was the other one? The New and the Li factions. Okay. And they will affect Li Shangyin. So Li Shangyin was born in 813, while he was relatively young, probably in his 30s. He passed the examinations to become a scholar official, and during his early years he was under the patronage of the New faction, and he served in some minor postings. But later on he married a member of the opposite faction, of the Lis. And of course, this was a definite no-no, and it meant that from then on, the New faction would haunt him and make sure that he never got an important appointment. So he had very minor posts: editor in the palace library, district defender of a small district, things like that. But he never managed to achieve a successful position. He was very frustrated, and this appears in his poems. A lot of poems of the late Tang, also of Du Mu, for example, tend to focus on merit unrewarded. But this is not such an unusual common in any period of Chinese poetry. Scholar officials always tended to consider that their merits were not properly rewarded and their ability was not properly used in office. But in the narrative that the Chinese literary tradition makes of the late Tang, one of the main ideas is this: that, it was a time of corruption, of eunuch power, of court infighting, of military, economic, social decadence. And the main symptom of this decadence is that good scholar officials like Li Shangyin or Du Mu were not employed in office. Okay, before passing to the poem itself, we would need to comment a little bit about Li Shangjing's poetry. Now, Li Shangjing is one of those poets that all literatures have that are generally considered very difficult to translate or completely untranslatable. So I imagine Góngora, Luis de Góngora in Spain has a similar status. I'm not sure what the English equivalent would be, perhaps Milton. We're talking about very Baroque poets. The common thread, at least in the parallelism between Li Shangyin and Luis de Góngora, is that they are poets of a declining empire, and they are poets of a Baroque persuasion. That is, they write a poetry that is dense, symbolic, a massive underplay at wordsmithing and at word craft. Very difficult poems to understand, even in the original languages, let alone in translations. So, Li Shangyin, one of the greatest poems of the Tang, but also one of the most difficult to understand, very elusive, very dark, which means he hasn't generally fared well with translations and translators, as one common trend in translations of classical Chinese poetry is to choose the poets that are less allegorical, less dark, the poems that are easier to perhaps translate into another language, into another culture. Nevertheless, as we say, Li Shangyin has 24 poems in this anthology, and remember, this anthology was composed for children. It's meant to be a first introduction, a primer on the classical Tang poetry for young children. So even when it includes poems by difficult authors like Li Shangjing, it generally includes, or it generally chooses, their simpler poems, the poems that are easier to understand, the poems with the least number of allusions and obscurities. And I think that pretty much applies to the poem that we have today, Cicada. So the cicada, we've already encountered poems on the cicada. Cicada is an insect, very typical in East Asia. It's like a very, very, very big insect. It's bigger than a thumb. And they mostly live in the summer, where they make a droning sound. Anybody who's been in Japan, for example, in the summer, is probably very used to their relentless droning during the day. And some ideas about cicadas is that they are almost slightly spiritual animal, as this poem shows. That is, they don't live. The classical Chinese believe they didn't eat food; they just made a living on dew. And of course, they were a seasonal animal. When the autumn colds came, they tended to disappear and die. So they were a symbol of ephemerality and of seasonal change. And sometimes poets like to associate with them when they're feeling melancholy, sad, ephemeral, and about to pass away. Now, this poem is not, as I said, a particularly complicated one. The main topic is, it's a pretty straightforward parallelism between the cicada and the poetic persona of Li Shangjing. In both cases, we have an animal or a person that is suffering from adversity because of its purity, of its honesty, and it's not going to save itself. So the idea is both the insect and the poet are living in hard times, times that are too tough or too inadequate or too corrupt or too evil for the worthy. And this will be the death of the worthy. And this poem plays very much, as I said, with the stereotypes inside the Chinese classical tradition about the late Tang period and its poetry as well. Okay then, so as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So the main topic, merit unrecognized, the suffering of the worthy, and this is done through a parallelism between the worthy poet and the insect. First couplet. Hard to be so lofty and sate your hunger, futile your whispers of distress. So the first couplet seems to be directly talking about the insect that gives the poem its title, the cicada. Two adjectives. It's hard, it's futile. What is hard? To be lofty and sate your hunger. The idea is the cicada is very lofty because it lives high on trees and it's disconnected from the material world. You could say it's an idealistic insect that doesn't stoop down to eating food. It just survives on the dew that falls from heaven. But of course, one might imagine that it's difficult to get satiated, to get full on dew. So the poet imagines the cicada as hungry. And futile, useless, your whispers of distress. That is, the poet is interpreting, as the Chinese tradition did, the droning of the cicadas in the summer, which is actually a love call, I believe. It's interpreting it as a lament, a crying, a whisper of distress at the oncoming end of the season and at the oncoming death of the cicadas. Of course, from the very beginning, we can see that these ideas also apply, or are very easily applied to the poet. The loftiness of the poet might refer to his purity, to his attempt at being honest, forthright, a Confucian moral exemplar. But it's saying, being so lofty, you cannot sate your hunger, you cannot eat, or more generic, you cannot get high positions in office, in power, and at court and at the administration. In futile your whispers, you may cry. Poetry is a way of expressing intentions, of crying, of complaining, but it's useless. This is, after all, a decadent era, and nobody's going to pay attention to Li Shangjing's cries. Second couplet. By the fifth watch, you've faded out, your green tree host indifferent to your fate. So the second couplet continues the line of the first one. After the description of the loftiness, the hunger, the cries of the insect, we get a little bit more background. It says, by the fifth watch, you faded out. I imagine fifth watch might refer to night. So maybe late at night, you no longer sing, or your sound has faded away. And the tree where you live is indifferent to your fate. Again, we're meant to read this, I imagine, in parallel to the situation of the poet himself. The fifth watch would refer, I don't know, maybe after a certain period, not an hour of the day, but now, after some time has passed, you are no longer recognized or perceived or even acknowledged by the power players at court, and your country, your society, which would be the green tree host, is indifferent to whatever happens to you. Third couplet. Scholar, tree, branch, both were helpless in a flood. My yard's already overgrown with weeds. Again, here, I think the translator, I imagine the original poem does not so clearly divide, the parallelism between the cicada and the poet. I imagine it creates a deliberate ambiguity that allows the poem to be read with the poet in mind and with the cicada in mind. But anyway, this couplet seems to be separating them. So both the scholar and the tree branch where the insect live, both of them were helpless in a flood. So imagine a big rain might have fallen that might have killed the cicadas, and the big flood is also symbolic of the party politics that managed to relegate Li Shangyin to a minor position. But anyway, against the flood that each of them had to encounter, both the scholar and the tree branch were helpless. There was nothing they could do. And the poet seems to be speaking in the first person in the next line, my yard's already overgrown with weeds. So I live in a desolate landscape. No cultivation is possible. Remember, this is an interesting thing. The word for culture comes from colere, and it's present in other words like agriculture. It comes from cultivation, originally cultivation of land. And that's in Latin. But I imagine here in Chinese, we're getting the same sort of metaphor. Agriculture, or the cultivation of the garden, the lack of cultivation of the garden, acts as a symbol for the end of one's cultivation, if not one of one's cultural cultivation, one's cultivation as a scholar official, as a person who is able to be active in the world for good. So the yard overgrown with weeds, in a way, represents the failure in the success of cultivating the world by the scholar official poet, or perhaps even the failure to cultivate himself. Finally, the last couplet. I'm troubled, sir, by your warning song. Down here, we too survive on empty air. So the final couplet summarizes, clarifies the ideas that were all the images that have been leading up to the end now. So once again, hearing the droning of the cicada, the poet identifying with it, it says he feels troubled by the warning song. Remember, the warning song of the cicada is death is about to come. Autumn is coming, and with it winter and death for insects. So here the warning song of the cicada might be your own death, Li Shangyin, amidst indifference and failure, is coming, or the death of the dynasty is coming. Whichever the thought, or both of them, they both trouble the mind of the poet. And he says, down here in this earthly realm, we too survive on empty air. Yeah. So I am like you, cicada. I also survive on idealism, but that's no sustainer in the long run. So quite a nice poem, quite simple. So very unlike the expectations one has about Li Shangyin, but I think it's quite a nice exercise in parallelism. Pretty well wrought.